Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. Now, in this episode, we're going to take a look at 10 Austro-German classics in literature. And of these 10, I have read 0 of them. But basically, the idea came to me while I was lying in bed the other night and during a gale. And I thought, do you know what? I haven't read that much from the German canon, and I couldn't answer why. One of the books in particular that's coming up in this list is one that's been on my shelf for absolutely ages, and I'm determined to read it, so maybe next year. So anyway, without further ado, let's get stuck in, shall we? The first book on our list is by Adalbert Stifter, if that's how you pronounce it. Adalbert Stifter writes a book called Rock Crystal, and this is back in the 19th century. Now, it's almost fairy tale apparently in its way of talking, but it's a short novella of about 75 to 80 pages, and it follows a brief excursion of 2 children, Konrad and Sana. Now, they live in a village, and another village has their auntie in it, and it's separated by a mountain. And they travel over the mountain to see their auntie on Christmas Eve. Now, they're old enough to travel, but their mum always says to them, make sure you're back by nightfall. They go over on Christmas Eve, but on the journey back, of course, the night falls quickly in the winter, and the snow starts to come down, and they take a wrong turn, and they're cut off from getting home. Now, none other than Thomas Mann, I believe it was, said that this book was just the most brilliant, suspenseful story. The way it builds and builds and builds suspense. Because what happens to the 2 children? How do people feel about it? Now, I don't know all the details, but one of the things about this book is not only is there suspense in it, but it's almost transcendental in its message. It's how nature is not just living, but it is life. We are attached to it. We're one with it. Almost like the spirituality. We don't need to be in the churches within the village to be connected spiritually, but with the whole scheme of nature itself. I've heard that a fair part of this book just lays scenery and builds up just the idea of the villages before there's suddenly a roller coaster of the children going on the journey and then getting lost and everything that subsequently follows. But I'm very intrigued. I don't know if you've even heard of Adalbert Stifter or you've read this book. I would imagine this sounds to me like something you would have read if you live in Germany, but maybe not if you live elsewhere. However, the idea that none other than Thomas Mann, of all people, says that it's brilliant at building suspense, the most suspenseful story he'd ever read, that is a big recommendation. At only 80 pages, it's not going to take long to get through either. So there you go. First one, Rock Crystal by Adalbert Stifter, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. The second book on our list of 10 Austro-German classics is by the famous author Hermann Hesse. Now, he is particularly renowned for his work Siddhartha, which many claim is his best work ever. And that's why I've not put it on this list. Instead, I'm picking a somewhat lesser known book. Maybe you've heard of it, but it wasn't one that's right at the forefront for me. And that is Steppenwolf, which basically is wolf of the steppes. So the wilds, the steppes, the hinterland, as it were. Now, this story, the protagonist is a chap called Harry Haller, and he's a bit of a morose, misanthropic character. And he makes his records of his life and his travelling, and he gives it to, I think it's the nephew of his landlady, some very obscure character. And basically, when it started to be read, he's recounting things that he's gone through, where he was walking through a town and someone came to him with an advertisement for the magical theatre. And along with giving him that advertisement, he also gets a book called The Treatise of the Steppenwolf. But this is where things become very interesting. It's like magical realism, a bit like Gabriel Marquez in his works. Because when Harry begins to read this treatise, it addresses him as Harry. And as he's reading about the Steppenwolf, he recognises a lot about himself and his own nature within it. You've got this higher plane of being a human, but also the animalistic urges and intrinsic, what would be the word to use here? Sort of instinctive nature of the animal. And he's betwixt and between the two, and he doesn't feel happy. And this treatise sort of talks to him about how he is one of the suicides. In other words, a character who is likely at some point in his life to commit suicide. But it counters that, or balances it, with offering him the chance to be something great, to be one of the immortals. Now, the story then progresses, sort of, he goes through the turmoil and tumult of having this double psyche. I don't mean schizophrenic, but you've got the higher plane of humans and the animalistic behaviour that we possess. And it carries on where he meets a bunch of other characters. Hermione, I think, is one who's quite influential on him. She can tease him, but also she sympathises with him when he expresses his thoughts about life. But he bumps into other characters like Mozart and Goethe. So I don't know how that works, but again, this magical realism setup. It sounds like a very, very intriguing book, and typically to explore our own inner psyche, our own inner workings. And I think he pursues the magical theatre as well. But how it all ends, I do not know. You may have read it. If so, any of the books that you hear me mention on this video, please, if you've read them, tell me what you thought of them. So others, because plenty of others read the comments. And we all love recommendations. So if you've heard of these or read these, tell us your thoughts. So that was the second one, Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse. So third on the list is quite a famous book actually, Berlin Alexanderplatz by Alfred Döblin. You may have come across this or at least heard of it. Now, this is called the story of the 1920s. Because that's when it's set for a start. And you have the main character, Franz Biberkopf, who has recently come out of prison. I believe he was in there because he had committed a murder. But now that he's been released, he's deciding he's going to go straight. He doesn't want to sink back into a life of crime. But the problem is, his life takes place in Alexanderplatz. And the problem with that is, that's sort of the down and dirty workers area of Berlin. And this book gets you hemmed in the slums and the dark shady alleyways and the pimps and the prostitutes and the gangsters and the no-goods. And he's constantly trying to rise above the temptation or the leadings that take him towards more crime. And then fate slings him a blow. There is another murder that takes place. And we see the turmoil for Franz because can he ever escape a life of crime? Can he ever go straight and leave his past in the past? Now, I do not know how this works out again, but one of the things that I find very interesting in this, in fact, there's two things I find interesting. This is said at a time when the Nazi Party is beginning to rise. So there's that atmosphere, that revolutionary churning morass of the sea of humanity kind of unease that's swaying through the story. And then, on top of that, Döblin, the author, apparently takes an interesting way of building this story up. It's sort of a montage of things. Apparently he flicks between first person and third person in his narrative. I don't know whether he flicks between characters as well. But he gets a lot of the story propelled along by using newspaper articles and speeches and the common slang of the day and stories. I think even biblical stories come into it. And so this propulsion by various means, by various medium. And what I love about that, the idea of it, is that's how we operate. We sort of ingest all this external information, which helps us make sense of the world around us. It colours our picture of reality. So I can't wait to see how this book works out. Now, I don't have it yet, but it's definitely one that I want to put on my reading list. Maybe it will be one of the 12 books I definitely will read next year. I'm not sure just yet. But have you read it? Berlin Alexanderplatz by Alfred Döblin. What did you think? So next on the list is a fascinating sounding novella called Michael Kohlhaas. Now, I'm probably butchering the German here, but it's Kohlhaas. I've got a picture of it right here anyway. And it's written by Heinrich von Kleist at the turn of the 18th to 19th century. So I think it was in the 1800s, like in the zeros, when he actually wrote it. And it's based on a real event in the 16th century. But this is essentially the plot, and I think it's a novella. There's the chap, he's a merchant called Michael Kohlhaas, and he trades in horses, and he's heading his way to Saxony. Now remember, Germany at this time is not one unified country. That doesn't happen until 1871. So you have those massive principalities like Saxony, like Saxe-Coburg, and Prussia and the like. So he's on his way to Saxony, and he's going through some territory owned by a Junker. A Junker would be the aristocratic set, landowners, and people with the word von in their name. They're Junkers. And this guy is Wenzel von Tronka, I think his name is. Anyway, this baron grabs hold of Michael and says, you don't have the correct papers to be travelling through. And so, as compensation, I'm going to take 2 of your horses. Well, Michael doesn't know what to do, so he leaves the horses and one of his men, one of his hands, with them, and he travels into Saxony, where he finds out that that wasn't correct compensation. The baron, the Junker, has taken too much from him. So he goes back and demands to have his horses back, but they've been worked in the fields and they're really haggard and worn out, and the man that he left behind has been beaten up. And so he applies to the courts for compensation until his horses can be restored and his man is looked after and taken care of. But this is where the boys' club, as it were, of the aristocracy comes in, because Tronka's family make sure that the case is kicked out. And so starts a dogged pursuit for justice by Michael Kohlhaas. Now, this will lead him into all sorts of danger, because if he can't get it legally, he tries to get it criminally and tries to gather support for his case. And this develops into something quite powerful, this obsession for justice. It's almost a hint of revenge. Now, how far will Michael take this? What will happen to Michael? What will happen to Tronka, the aristocrat? And will the society of the day, the aristocratic hoi polloi, will they close ranks altogether? Will they be able to resist an uprising against them? All of that is in this book, and apparently it is a very influential piece of work in German literature. So this is something I would be intrigued to look at, and I must admit the cover for the vintage book, the vintage edition, the red spines, looks amazing. I wouldn't mind just having the book for its cover. So there you go. Michael Kohlhaas by Heinrich von Kleist. Have you ever heard of it? So next up in our list is Effi Briest by Theodore Fontaine. Effi Briest is Germany's answer to Madame Bovary by Flaubert over in France. But it's not simply another Madame Bovary retelling. This is an idea, this tragic adultery story, this tragic tale of adultery and the fallout for the woman, and how society dictates a lot of people's perception of the guilty party and how they integrate into society, or whether they're allowed back into society. Because you have Madame Bovary as an example, but also think of Anna Karenina by Tolstoy. Covers the same topic. And Effi Briest, I believe, was written in 1894, 1895. Now, that's the same time that Thomas Hardy was writing Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I think that was 1891-92. Now, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, not quite about an adulterous relationship, but that depiction of women in society and the harsh treatment, the harsh standards of society for those who make mistakes and fall. Now, Effi Briest sounds to me different to Flaubert's Madame Bovary, because the way the story goes, or the way it starts at least, is Effie is married to a chap called Innstetten, and he's a government official. He may even be part of the aristocracy, I'm not sure about that, but he's very much into his position in society, and he's constantly going away to work for weeks at a time. Now, of course, that's going to make you lonely at home. And this is compounded by the fact that the village they live in, Effie can't get in with the society. They seem to reject her. And so she's very isolated. And then, naturally, along comes some gallant gentleman in the cavalry, a captain, I think his name is Krampas. I might be wrong there, but I'm sure it's Captain Krampas. And he is a womanizer. He's known to be a womanizer. He's also married, but he's charming and he pays her attention. And can you completely fault someone whose husband is always away for trying to find some affection, even if it wasn't meant to be extramarital, just affection? And so eventually Effie and this captain consummate the affair. Later on, her husband is going to find out. And this is no spoiler, because Effi Briest is well known as, you know, one of those disastrous, adulterous relationships. So how does he respond? Is he going to tolerate her? They have a daughter, Annie, I think her name is. Now, what's the husband going to do with Annie? Because the courts nearly always come down on the side of the husband in these days. And what about society? How will they react to Effie? What about her family? How will they respond to her? There's a lot of little cogs in place here, and it explores the setup of society, almost a dual class divide, a distinction between different people. And how far is society to blame? And what conclusions do the main characters come to in their observation of that society? Remember, this is the great thing about classic literature, as I often say on this channel. It doesn't just give you a story, it asks you to tussle with the world that you are in. It asks you to engage with ethics, with morality, with right and wrong. And even if wrongdoing is done, can you at least sympathise with the wrongdoer? Can you sympathise with the standards of society of the day? All of this seems to come up in Effi Briest, and it's sort of a European-wide exploration at this point of women's place in society. What does stand out to me as seemingly to be different between Effie and Emma Bovary is Emma Bovary, oh my days, is like one of the biggest fatheads in all of literature. I have no sympathy for her. What's her husband's name? The doctor. Charles, isn't it? Charles Bovary. He doesn't leave Emma Bovary. He's there. He's present. He may be a bit dull. Village life may be a bit insipid. But Emma Bovary's demise is all down to herself. In fact, that would be a good video, wouldn't it? Madame Bovary. Would you like me to do a review of Madame Bovary? Classic piece of French literature there. What I get from researching Effi Briest is that she is not like Emma in that she willfully just follows her own volition. She seems to be more at the mercy of happenstance and more at the mercy of society than Emma was. Bovary, she could have changed her life quite easily. So that's Effi Briest. Have you read it? Could you compare it to Madame Bovary or against Anna Karenina, for instance? What are your thoughts? Next on our list is a book which is extraordinarily famous as a classic piece of literature, and that is the Radetzky March by Joseph Roth. Now, this is a book I have to read next year. This has been on my reading list for goodness knows how long. I really like the idea of going through it, but I don't know what stopped me from digging in. The Radetzky March is one of those generational novels. It follows 3 generations of the Trotter family. Now, I have to smile here. Every British person will know why I'm grinning. The Trotters are a very they're a very famous sitcom family. Dalboy and Rodney Trotter in a sitcom called Only Fools and Horses, which is absolutely brilliant. It's sort of 1980s, but it's so funny. It's part of British culture. So to have a book which has an aristocratic family called the Trotters is somewhat ironic. Anyway, I'll try not to laugh whenever I say Trotter. You have at the beginning an infantry lieutenant by the name of Trotter. And he is in a skirmish during, let's see, this is the Habsburg monarchy. So you've got Franz Joseph I, Emperor of the Habsburgs. And they're currently, let's see, 1850, 1859. They're in the battle with Napoleon III of France. So there's a bit of a war raging there. Now, in one of the skirmishes, this Lieutenant Trotter, he pushes the emperor off his horse, apparently, to save him from being shot by snipers. And it's one of these life's little ironies, one of these little things that sets forth a whole bunch of events that changes a family's life. Because he's then raised to being a baron by the emperor. He's made nobility because of saving the emperor's life. And Trotter's father feels proud of him because there's something special about my son. He wants to carry on normally with his friends, but they see him now as a nobleman, and so he's drawn into the orbit of aristocratic life, which he feels uncomfortable with. Now, not only that, later on he notices that there's a revisionism of history, and he mentions this to the emperor, that something's been changed regarding his own life and how he saved the emperor, which isn't accurate. And it's interesting that this is brought up in the idea of empire in a ruling elite class, which you sort of still get today, where those in higher positions want to revise history to make the plot of history sound more flattering and appealing to the current ruling parties. This happens, and so von Trotter, he doesn't want his son to go into the army. And so his son doesn't go in the army. He does something else. And we follow the second son then, so second Baron Trotter. And you see his life. And then he has his son, but he does send him into the army. And things have changed. Now, what's so brilliant about the Radetzky March is that this portrayal of 3 generations of the Trotter family is a microcosm, a miniature of the Habsburg monarchy itself, which in the 1850s was at its zenith. You know, it was an extraordinarily wealthy monarchy, maybe not as powerful as the British monarchy, but very influential and very rich, and it did hold sway over vast parts of Europe. But before the First World War, which is the 3rd generation of the Trotters, it's at its nadir. It's gone right to the bottom. It's about to collapse. As you know, with your history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the killing of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, there was a lot of nationalist resurgence and resentment against Austria. Germany had already broken away from Austria in the Prussian-Austro War, and the Serbs were raising up to throw off the shackles of the Habsburg monarchy. So it's about to collapse, and this is all captured in miniature in the Radetzky March through the lens of one aristocratic family, the von Trotters of all things. So there you go. Have you read the Radetzky March? Would you like to do a read along with me next year? I really think this might be a book which a lot of people would enjoy, and I'd love to read it along with someone. So let me know in the comments. The next book that I want to talk to you about sounds absolutely thrilling, like a real tense, nail-biter, edge of the seat, tugging at your hair kind of scaring book. And it was written in 1947. It's called Alone in Berlin, written by Hans Fallada, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It only got translated into English relatively recently, since 2000 anyway. And it's recognised as a great, great work because it's set in 1940 Berlin. Now, 1940 Berlin, we're talking the height of the Nazi Party here, because 1940 is when they're raging war in France and taking over. They've already took over Poland. So the German people are quite high on nationalism, and the Nazi Party has a vice-like grip over everybody. And it's in that stultifying shroud of constant suspicion and fear, because you've got the Gestapo, the secret police. And we're focused in on number 55 Jablonski Street, where the various residents live, and you've got different kinds of people. You've got a very nervous widow, you have a retired judge, then you have ardent Nazi supporters there, and you also have a couple called Anna and Otto, I think it is, Quangel. Now, everything seems okay until the news comes in that the Quangels have lost their son in battle in France. And this kicks off an emotional reaction to the state. And Otto, who's normally a reserved, very serious, quiet character, who's the foreman at a factory, him and his wife decide to go on a campaign to undermine the Nazis, to promote a resistance to them by scattering postcards with messages which say things like, "Mother, Hitler has killed your son. Hitler will kill your sons too." And obviously this is a very dangerous thing to do. Anyone that resists the Nazi state is threatened with capture, torture, death. And so how do they keep this campaign against the Nazis up when the whole neighbourhood, the whole world, it seems, of the German Reich is against them, where people are so scared to even acknowledge a message that they find? They'll turn that in to the Gestapo in case they're caught with it and people think they're against the Nazis, leading to an instant tribunal at the People's Court. You know, who wants to go to one of those? Now, when I was looking into this, apparently it's not just their story, but you have a Gestapo officer. Now, his name, Esterich, I think it is, Esterich. His job by the Obergruppenführer is find whoever is putting these messages about and bring them to justice. But he's got to track them down. So it's cat and mouse. Can he draw conclusions on who's causing this trouble? Can the Quangels get away with it? Do they escape to an allied country? I don't know. What is the overall result? But isn't that the perfect backdrop for a tense book? There's nothing more tense than Gestapo Germany. Or anywhere with the secret police, you know, like the Stasi in East Germany under the Soviets. You know, that's a horrid idea, to always be looking over one's shoulder. So, have you read this? Alone in Berlin by Hans Fallada, I think is the name. Now, the next book that I found in my research was a complete Easter egg. You know, one of those finds which you just weren't expecting, from an author I've never even heard of called Wilhelm Hauff, who apparently is famous for his fairy tales, but this is a story he wrote, and it's called Lichtenstein. And there's something I like about this story, the idea of it. It's a response to Sir Walter Scott, you know, the writer of Ivanhoe and Waverley and Rob Roy and all those medieval romantic historic novels which swept through Victorian England like a great big broom sweeping through something. Apparently, Walter Scott's works were avidly consumed by the German public as well. And so Wilhelm Hauff wrote Lichtenstein as a response to Walter Scott's writing. The way he put it was, Germans seem more familiar with the landscape of Scotland than they do with Germany, because they read that much of Walter Scott's historical novels. Then he makes the point that the forests of the Highlands of Scotland are no greener than the forests of Germany, and the waters of the Tweed are no bluer than the waters of the Danube. And so he does what Walter Scott does, and he makes an imaginary character and puts him into a real historical family. Now, the historical character, his name is George Sturmfeld or something like that. And basically, he gets to see the events of the aristocratic Ulrich von Württemberg. In fact, Ulrich von Württemberg is a real character. He was called, I believe, the Henry VIII of Swabia. And he wasn't all that popular, to be quite honest, because he put massive taxes on food stocks, particularly meat in that region. And you had the Swabian League as a response who sort of came against him as a peasant uprising. And what happens in this book is Ulrich is seen as more the good guy from the part of George, our protagonist. And yeah, it's very much a Sir Walter Scott book, this medieval history, even though the good guy in real life wasn't the best of guys. But it went down a storm, no pun intended, being as the protagonist's surname is Sturmfelder or something. So much so that it made the German public start writing, or the German writers start writing more Walter Scottian kind of books. And Lichtenstein Castle, as seen today, was a ruin, but was rebuilt the way it is because of this book. People loved it that much, and it became a tourist attraction as well. So that's reason enough to read a book like that, to find the German Walter Scott, whose name is not Walter, but Wilhelm Hauff. Have you read anything by this man? Have you read Lichtenstein? Be honest, have you even heard of this book? Next on our list is another Theodore. Not Theodore Fontaine this time, but Theodore Storm. Have you heard of this writer? You may have come across probably his most famous work is The Rider of the White Horse. Now, that's not the book I'm talking about here. The book I want to talk about is The Dykemaster. Just a comment though about Theodore Storm. He was part of the Sturm und Drang movement, so quite sensationalist, active novels. But he was prolific in his output. If you start looking at German literature around the 1870s, all the way through the 1880s and into the 1890s, Theodore Storm, he comes up a lot in notable works of German classic literature. So I didn't know he was that prodigious in his output. But The Dykemaster sort of caught my fancy. What you have this young gentleman who is the Dykemaster, so obviously near a coast with flatlands. And he's come up with building a dike to protect his local community, who he seems to not gel with very well. And he wants to do the best for them, but they don't seem to appreciate what he's doing. And he builds the dike in a new style, a new way. So that's already not the best thing. People like the same, but he's standing out by being inventive. Now, at the end of building a dike, to celebrate the building, there's this very curious ritual, and I haven't been able to track down whether this is based on some real folklore or it's just made up for the book. But after building the dike, they want him to carry out a ritual sacrificing of a dog. Why a dog? I don't know. You know, what's wrong with chickens? But he won't do this ritual, whether that's because he's more pragmatic, more scientific, doesn't believe in all that superstition. But because he won't, people begin to think that there's something wrong with him, that he's got the hand of evil upon him, and maybe that's because he designed the dike in a different way. Now, whenever a storm arises, or a high flood of the seas, he can be seen riding up and down the coast, or up and down the dike, on his grey horse. Now imagine a grey horse with sort of the pall of of rain, the curtain sweep of heavy rain, the salted atmosphere of foaming seas. He comes to take on the idea of a phantom for the community, just this vague rider riding through on a grey horse of all things. And legends start to develop around him. Now, I don't know any more of how this story develops, but I love the idea of the outcast who has a mythos develop, an aura around them. It starts off that he must have some evil presence about him. Then this idea of him being a ghostly rider and the thrall that must hold over a community. You know, it's typical. People cannot be isolated. You can't find an isolated building or ruin or person without some fantastic story developing around them, whether it's true or not. So I really like the idea of this book, and I certainly do want to read some of Theodore Storm's works, since I realise how much he actually wrote. You know, he must have been really good because he was popular enough to keep going. So there's the next one, The Dykemaster by Theodore Storm. So our final book on this list of Austro-German classic literature is from the eminent writer Johann von Goethe, famous for The Sorrows of Young Werther. Now, this one, though, that we're going to talk about is thought by many, I think critically acclaimed, to be his finest work, and it's called Elective Affinities. The idea behind this is just magnificent. Again, I mentioned Sturm und Drang earlier with Theodore Storm. He followed the Sturm und Drang class or genre. Goethe was part of the initial movement 100 years before, and so you have this high romanticism, action, storm and stress. That's what Sturm und Drang means. So a really exploration of the passions of humankind. Now, Elective Affinities is curious because it's essentially not an allegory, a parable. It's a scientific parable. The phrase elective affinities was used in the 17th century by chemists and physicists, theoreticians like Isaac Newton, for instance. Elective affinity originally meant a chemical reaction with an exothermic result, so heat producing, but later came to mean a reaction in chemicals where one ion is replaced by another. And this idea is taken by Goethe and applied physically to the love relationships of human beings, their passions. That sort of gives you the idea of heat, doesn't it? And whether there's an underlying chemistry that draws characters together. So that's a great idea. Whether it's true or false doesn't matter. So what you have in this book, you have two characters, Edward and Charlotte. Now, they've been childhood sweethearts, but they married two different people, and then both their spouses die, and they've eventually got together. And they're part of the nobility, so Edward becomes very energetically engaged in re-landscaping the property, and he's supported by Charlotte. When a couple come along and are introduced to them and end up staying with them, and that is a Captain Otto and a young girl called Ottilie. Now, I don't think that's an accident that their names are so similar. It's like the chemical compounds, isn't it? And it charts sort of the interactions of the four, because Edward and Charlotte, their marriage is more one of friendship and convenience than it is one of passion and lust. And unsurprisingly, I don't think I'm giving anything away here because this is all very early in the book, Captain Otto, who is very energetic and flamboyant, he gives Edward advice on how to landscape and improvements he could make. He's very full of energy. And him and Charlotte start getting an attraction to each other. Meanwhile, Ottilie, she goes inside and is taught by Charlotte how to manage a house and look after an estate. And she does quite well. She takes over a lot of it. But she's a timid and retiring character, unlike the energetic Otto. And she and Edward come to like one another. What's going to happen? Does a chemistry underpin marriage? Does it get in the way of marriage? What should happen with love? Is it, like chemical reactions, a foregone conclusion that you are drawn to people and there's no separating it? Now, things do happen with the four, not as you expect. Two of them leave at one point. I don't know whether they come back. I'm pretty sure they must for the story to carry on. But it won't be the ones who you think that leave. Do any of the couples get together? Does Charlotte get her wish for her and Edward to go back to the status quo, to going back to as they were before Captain Otto and Ottilie came along? Isn't that a fascinating sounding love quadrangle? You know, what's going to happen here? And this parable based in the idea of elective affinities, chemical reaction, the chemistry of love, the chemistry of humans. Because of course from the Renaissance we get this very deterministic idea that you can boil us down to our atoms. Which of course has changed over time, but at that time was a very reasonable thing to explore through the medium of story. So those are the 10 books. I believe there was 10 of them. I don't think I've gone over. 10 books from Austro-German literature, which I've looked up. I've not read any of them. I just thought I'd share them with you because I know you like recommendations of books you may not have heard of, or maybe books you have heard of, like the Radetzky March, for instance, or Berlin Alexanderplatz, but haven't actually took the time to get to know what the synopsis is. Can I ask, if you've read any of these books, state which one, tell us what you thought of them and whether they made you think of some other kinds of books. Or if not, which ones appeal to you? And do you fancy doing a read-along with me of the Radetzky March next year? Anyway, until the next time, I wish you joy in your reading.